On today's show, what is going on in Toronto and what does the future look like for Pascal Siakam? But this does relate to the Milwaukee Bucks because it got me thinking about the value of players across the league, not only from a salary perspective, but also what teams have been cashing in on trades for star players over the last few years. So we're going to talk about the Raptors, Siakam, how it relates to the Milwaukee Bucks, and then I might even get Justin's opinion on some topics I discussed on yesterday's show.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are Locked On Bucks. My name's Kane Pittman. You can see and hear me on this show Monday to Friday and find my work over at ESPN, and alongside me from the Bucks Radio Network, Justin Garcia, a man who is counting down the days until preseason begins so we can get back to the grind for another 6 months with the Milwaukee Bucks. Today's episode brought to you by FanDuel, and we thank everyone for making Locked On Bucks your first watch or first listen of every weekday and providing the feedback and the content for everyone right through August, which, let's face it, the dead period of the NBA, there's not a lot going on. So when you get some news about a player the caliber of Pascal Siakam, you're very happy when you're running a daily podcast. But we appreciate the support and continue to drop your questions and your podcast ideas, particularly on the YouTube channel. It's probably the easiest to access us as we continue to run through the show. But if you haven't yet, drop a comment, subscribe on whatever platform you listen to us, rate, review, and all those things, because it helps continue to grow the show as we build up to training camp coming up next month. And then the season will be here before we know it. Justin, this is absolutely the dead period of the NBA. And even this little bit of news that came out today regarding Pascal Siakam, it wasn't actually necessarily news because it doesn't seem like there's any advancement with Pascal Siakam, who is eligible for an extension this year and moving through. He's got 1 year left on his deal before he becomes an unrestricted free agent. But I always find it so fascinating when you see these teams that could potentially make a move with these star caliber players, because it absolutely relates back to the Bucks.
Yeah, well, and first of all, I want to correct you on one. It's at least 8 months, maybe 9 for the season, not 6. This was just the anomaly year, at least we hope, where you had so much time in the offseason. But yeah, and so there's a lot with this Pascal Siakam thing. I think most people are still kind of scratching their heads over what Toronto has done or is doing and has done for the last year or so with their personnel moves. The Siakam thing, I remember early on, you heard, well, Toronto's not moving him, and everything else that you looked at with the Raptors, you're like, well, they've got to trade him, don't they? And especially if he's showing no indication of signing an extension, like you have to move him. You can't lose Fred VanVleet for nothing, and then potentially the same with Pascal Siakam. But the other interesting thing that has kind of popped up is if in fact and I didn't research how credible this was, so if it's not, I guess it's a bad job by me for even introducing it. But if in fact his agent is letting it be known he's not going to sign an extension wherever he's traded, we saw what it took some time, but we saw what Adam Silver did and the communication he sent out when Damian Lillard essentially said the same thing through his agent to teams that weren't the Miami Heat. So is this going to become the new thing now that the NBA is going to have to police of all the start and stops with the tampering period and no tampering? And now we're going to have to look into how do we make sure teams and players don't use agents to get out there, don't trade for this guy.
So it's certainly at this point in time, and again, it's complicated the trade value a little bit because it is only the 1 year. So to your point, you're bang on. I think we were all talking about the Raptors a lot. We had crossover podcasts with Locked On Raptors wondering if they were going to make a move. And ultimately, they finished 41-41. So they were a 500 team. The Bucks have always had troubles with the Raptors. And I remember podcasting with you leading into the play-in tournament and first round, asking what would be the worst possible result for the Bucks. And I felt pretty strongly, and maybe this is just because I worry too much about past results, but the Raptors and the Heat were teams that concerned me. Well, it turns out to be valid for the Miami Heat. But this Raptors team is just so curious. With Siakam in general, from the report, and this was from The Athletic, from Shams Charania, it was more around the idea that negotiations hadn't even really started or got in depth between the Raptors and Siakam. And this is a little bit strange because, as was outlined in the story, and we've discussed this as we tie it back to the Bucks again with Giannis, that I don't expect Giannis to do anything this offseason, and I don't know why he would do it 2 years early, but certainly next year. I think the pressure or the storylines and the interest will absolutely ramp up around Giannis and the Bucks. And we have seen players over recent times sign contracts and not really worry too much about it because they're like, hey, if I want to get traded, I'll get traded in a year's time anyway. So even from that perspective, this is interesting with Siakam that he might actually go all the way to free agency. You just don't see it a lot.
Yeah, I think it was Brian Windhorst that was talking about it on one of his recent pods that free agency is basically dead. Like free agency has kind of become for guys that are getting the veterans minimum or who's going to get the taxpayer mid-level or the full mid-level. That's become the extent of it. I mean, Kawhi's the last big name to leave through free agency, ironically leaving Toronto. But when you look at it, even like things like cap room, when we talk about keeping that, sure, you still need some flexibility and it's going to help you do some things, but how important is cap room anymore either? That if a superstar wants to go somewhere, he's going to get there, is what we've seen from the last handful of years, 5 or so years in the previous CBA. But yeah, it's no longer free agency and we got to shed as much money as we can. I know we've seen some teams doing that recently, but everything that's been done has been through not just offseason, but like in-season trades. And that's where all the player movement has come from.
So I want to talk about, and certainly in the YouTube comments, again, let us know your thoughts of where the Toronto Raptors currently stand and how you would approach the Pascal Siakam situation, because I think it's fascinating. I want to get to next where Siakam actually stands in the pecking order of NBA star players. He's a 2-time All-Star, 2-time All-NBA player. Because his extension figure is a lot when you compare to a couple of our friends here in Milwaukee. So we'll get to that next after we talk about FanDuel, our sponsor of today's podcast. Football season is about to kick off, and FanDuel is giving you the chance to win all season long because right now, when you bet on a Super Bowl winner, you can get bonus bets every time they win in the regular season. Just pick any team to win the Super Bowl, and you'll get bonus bets back for every victory. Justin, Packers Super Bowl, would you feel confident about that one?
I haven't kept up with them as closely the last handful of years as I did in the past, but I still feel confident enough to say no, I would not be all over that bet.
Well, there might be some value there on FanDuel, but you can use your bonus bets on spreads, player props, over and unders, and more. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and start earning bonus bets with America's #1 sportsbook. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. All right, we're going to start to get into some crossover podcasts over the next week, particularly with the teams in the Eastern Conference that make sense, that might be in contention with the Bucks. So if there's a particular team you want me to jump on a podcast with and discuss in detail, let us know in the comments, and we'll try and make that happen over the next week or so as we roll through to training camp. The figure or the extension figure for Pascal Siakam, once again in this story from Shams Charania, 4 years, $192 million. So that's, if I do my quick math, that's high 40s. I always wasn't too bad at maths. That's high 40s. So a significant amount of cash. He's owed around $37 million this year. So this is, and this would be a bump up in salary. Where do you think Pascal Siakam lies in the overall landscape? Keeping in mind that he is not too far off from turning 30. And this was always the funny thing to me when we saw comparisons. Oh, Siakam's starting to rise. And it's like, oh, he's got some Giannis characteristics. And it's like, okay, well, first of all, he's older than him. And Giannis is already an MVP. So let's just chill out with that. But where would you see the value of that contract? Because we always talk about, and I think sometimes it's a silly conversation, your number one guy, where do they sit in the pecking order on a championship team? I don't think I have Siakam as the type of player at this point in time. We've seen a lot, and he's a very fine player, that if he's your best player, it feels like you're just off the mark of those other contending teams.
Yeah, you're not you're not a championship contender if
he's not a top 10 player. Yeah.
No, I don't. So you're not a championship contender if he's your best player. I don't think he's certainly not a top 10.
Conservative.
I don't know if he's a top 25, even when you look at a lot of those names are going to pop in there.
Is he in the Chris Middleton, Drew Holiday comments? And I know that people will sit back and that people maybe for the Bucks fans will have their different, dislikes about Middleton and Holiday and those things. And certainly at this point in time, I think if you compare just the straight box score numbers, we know that's not a perfect example. But if you look at the per 36 stuff, he's very comparable to Chris Middleton. Clearly, there's more size, there's more athleticism. Siakam can do more on the defensive end. But if you're talking, and that's the reason why I said not a top 10 player, because ultimately, if you want to win a title, you need a top 10 player. Top 10.
Yeah.
But if you're saying he might not be top 25, then I think most rankings that we see from all different outlets have Holiday, Middleton in that 25 to 40 range.
Yeah, I'd be curious to see when we get closer to the season, the updated list. I know Sports Illustrated used to do it. The Ringer does it as well. And on all the publications that do it, I would assume Chris and Drew would take a little bit of a hit this year just because of the playoffs results and the fact that, they're guys that are into their 30s and getting older. Yep. But with Siakam, he was a guy that, coming into this past season too, there was a lot of, I wouldn't say hype, but kind of a lot of intrigue to see, can this guy continue to take a leap? You referenced the age, and I think it's easy to forget too. I believe he was college teammates with Tony Snell to just show how old he is. Yeah. But the first half of the season, especially, you saw some of it, but to me, his best role is just as a number 2 on a team. And, when you look at those rankings of guys that are in those 20s, I think what we saw in the second half of the season is a lot of those guys that you might have looked at closer to 30 and past 25, or at least in the early 20s, those guys have a handful of them have jumped past him. I mean, Jimmy Butler is definitely a guy that you would, age aside, you would definitely take over Pascal Siakam. Even a guy like Bam Adebayo, that's at least an interesting conversation of, would you rather have him or would you rather have Pascal Siakam? So that's the tough part, is we saw a handful of guys take a little bit of a step last year. And I think a guy like Siakam, who is clearly not a number 1, and that's not a knock on him. You referenced the comps to Chris Middleton. It's, you can still win with a guy like that. They just can't be your number 1 guy. That's where it does get tough on the one hand with the money that you're referencing. I'd be $48 million a year. And I guess it's kind of the same conversation with Jaylen Brown, obviously more money, but Jaylen Brown has gone deeper in the playoffs. And I think if you're picking between the two, you would take Jaylen Brown over Pascal Siakam. The one thing I would point out, though, is, we talked about player movement and trades. I mean, first and foremost, if he's open to it, you have to just sign him, if for no other reason than to have that asset that you could ultimately move if he does want to go somewhere. But the other thing and the big thing, which it's tough to really gauge or quantify this year, and it won't come for a couple of years, is I think it's easy to get hung up on $48 million. That's a lot of money for Siakam in the Jaylen Brown contract. It is a lot, but we have a salary cap that is going to be over $200 million within the next couple of years. And that's still a quarter of your salary cap. But the more that goes up, as the cap is expected to increase 10% in each of the next few years, the more that goes up, the less these deals jump off the page of, man, that's a lot of money to pay him. It is right now. And not to say that it won't be a lot and the contract wouldn't potentially age poorly, but I do think we have to be aware of, this might in first blush look really bad, but as time goes on and that cap continues to rise, it's not going to be what you think it is.
Yeah, and I think to your point, initially on the rankings and all those types of things, I think you're absolutely right. Certainly for Chris Middleton, there is kind of some element of, well, you're going to get back healthy this year and prove it that you're still that level of player. I totally agree with that. And you would think with the age stuff being a couple of years older, that over the next few years, Siakam absolutely should be a better player. I think that's fine to say that. But if he does sign this extension, he's also going to be earning around $20 million more than Chris Middleton as well. So that's just, when you look at the value of players, when you look at the contracts that some guys are getting paid, that's going to be the challenging decision for some of these NBA franchises moving forward. And again, it was why it was kind of a surprise and kind of nice that you got that number with Chris Middleton there. So we'll see what they can bring. But both players have won a title in that probably preferred role, with Kawhi Leonard with the Toronto Raptors, and then obviously Giannis in Milwaukee as well. There was discussions around potential trade packages and teams that could be involved with Pascal Siakam. And I think it's so interesting to look at the overall trade market and the values and the packages that teams have got to put together for some of these types of players. So we might discuss that next. The Atlanta Hawks, always a team that seem to be interested in trades, but it sounds like they're interested in Pascal Siakam.
Yeah, and to me the names that were kind of linked in that are the most interesting, because we talked about expecting that guys like Chris and Drew would slide a little bit down on those top whatever players lists and where Pascal Siakam ranks. But those names with the Atlanta Hawks that at least according to the initial reports, here's our first offer, those are names that a year ago were guys that everybody was salivating over. Like, man, these are the types of guys you want, 3-and-D wing players, especially a guy like DeAndre Hunter, who it seems like we've heard his name kicked around in a couple of potential deals this offseason. That it just goes to show you how quickly things can change.
Yeah, AJ Griffin, another player there, and then obviously draft capital as well. But confusing this whole situation is just the idea that if he says, well, I'm not signing an extension in Atlanta regardless, then that becomes problematic and you give away draft capital and a couple of young players as well. And Atlanta continues to be a team that's in flux. I don't know about the makeup of this Raptors roster still anyway. We've been talking about this a lot. The idea, if you drop off or trade Pascal Siakam, Scotty Barnes is going to be a guy that's going to get a more prominent role, but OG Anunoby is someone we've discussed over and over and over again on this podcast. And every year he feels like the guy that's going to have the big breakout year. And he was good last year. He was really good. But I think that he's a guy that's always been intriguing. What about another player that we certainly discussed around the trade deadline? Gary Trent Jr. Where do you sit on Gary Trent? Because he is a guy that's in a fascinating situation with Toronto as well. If you look at the salary for him this year, he's going to be a unrestricted free agent at the end of this season. And yet again, he does fit in that sort of $18 million salary, like a bunch of these players that we've said you'd have to combine a couple of the Bucks mid-level salaries to get there. But as an expiring contract, he can probably be had for at least a little bit of a lower price than some of the other guys we've discussed, Colin Sexton, etc.
So is this just basically we're circling the Raptors here just because like it seems like they just need,
it feels like they're going to be doing something,
one little nudge, and it's going to become a fire sale. Yeah,
maybe.
I don't disagree, and I think one of the names that you mentioned, I don't think there's any way the Bucks could land him because of they don't have the capital you would think. But I mean, if you're going to trade Pascal
Siakam trade, you're in on a Siakam trade.
No. If you're going to trade Pascal Siakam, and you already, I think we can say you screwed up with Fred VanVleet, that there were no indications he wanted to remain there. It seemed like everybody knew not only is he testing free agency, he's probably leaving in the offseason, and you held on to him. That's a big mistake. Not only that, you give up assets to bring in Jakob Poeltl when everything screamed, let's just trade guys like VanVleet, like Gary Trent, who you just referenced, and let's build around Scotty Barnes for a couple of years from now. And now they're kind of caught in no man's land. To me, especially if you move Pascal Siakam, it makes zero sense to hold on to OG Anunoby. And especially if the asking price was what it was last year, or not asking price, if the offers were what they were near the deadline, where you had teams offering multiple first-round picks for him, it is criminal if you don't move him and you're moving Pascal Siakam. So I agree, and I like what you're doing with the exercise of, well, it seems like this is about to go over the cliff in Toronto. So let's see what we can pry loose. And Gary Trent is interesting. I think I would rather have Gary Trent. I think most people would say I'd rather have Gary Trent than a guy that the Bucks just brought in. But for the value that they brought him in Beasley, it's very comparable what they can do. I think obviously Trent is a better shooter, not by a wide margin, but he's a better shooter than Beasley. But still, I think they kind of fill the same role, ideally, at least, if this pans out.
It's going to be interesting. We continue to discuss the idea of what the Bucks will do, and I reference almost 3 times a week your suggestion that the starting 2-guard might not be there on the roster. But I think it is worthwhile as we continue to go through the season and look at these teams in the Eastern Conference. It doesn't have to be the East, but there are teams that are making moves. And, we even read reports that the Bucks had some interest in John Collins, or at least picked up the phone and asked the question. So it seems like they're throwing lines out there and they're at least intrigued, because I discussed this on yesterday's podcast and I'm fascinated how you feel about it. The idea of how many guys the Bucks have on the roster now, because again, you hope that the young guys emerge, but I don't know whether there's a concern about how many guys and how deep they run in terms of playoff playability and playoff players right now. Still, obviously, months and months away from the postseason, things will change, but it just feels, and I can't shake it, that there's going to be some changes.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be that way with a handful of teams. I mean, to me, 2 of the more fascinating teams outside of the Bucks, and as we've talked about a couple of times, it still feels like, I know we're close to camp, we're about a month away from that starting to pick up, but it still feels like when you look at the roster, like it's probably about 90% done. It feels like there's still at least one thing that has to be taken care of here. You'd certainly like some more ball handling depth. So I'm not convinced that the Bucks are done before the deadline or anything in season. But the 2 interesting teams are the ones that stand out the most to me, other than teams like Portland and Miami and Philly, who are all kind of in waiting periods here, is the 2 that we've talked about at length so far, and that's Toronto for the obvious reasons, and then Atlanta too, because you referenced the John Collins move, but for the last 2 years, really after that improbable, I think we can say, conference finals run, the Hawks just seemed like one of those teams that when you look at it, you say, well, they have too many guys, that you kind of have to do a 2-for-1 or a 3-for-1 deal, because you can start to build this depth. And I think pretty soon we're going to have this conversation with the Thunder as well, that you can get all these young pieces and it's, hey, they got this guy and this guy and this guy, and they're all developing, and it's good for about a year or 2. But then it becomes, well, they all got to play, and we don't have room for them to all play, or we got to limit minutes, or they don't necessarily fit together. So I think the Hawks have been in that spot for a couple of years where they have some nice pieces, but you also need a star. And, we've seen Trae Young have moments, but the jury's still out of, can he be the main guy on a team that's going to win? But if they were to pull off a deal for Pascal Siakam, that to me would be interesting, because it's going to cost you some nice pieces, we think, in a guy like DeAndre Hunter and AJ Griffin, who showed some very strong promise, including against the Bucks last year. But you would essentially be trading those pieces and John Collins for Pascal Siakam. And I'm not going to sit here and say that John Collins is better than Pascal Siakam, but you're still bringing in a guy at the same position for a guy that was making about half as much with 2 years on that deal. So you're giving up quite a bit to get a little bit better at that position.
Yes, you mentioned the Oklahoma City Thunder, and I'm open to all, drop them in the comments. I'm open to all suggestions for a Josh Giddey trade. That would be absolutely thrilling for me. One last note from today's show, and it's again another Shams treat. The Golden State Warriors. It is a Shams a treat, though, it has to be said. But a Shams tweet, the Warriors are holding free agent workouts. Dion Waiters, Kent Bazemore, JTA, Harry Giles, Trey Burke, Tony Snell. So I got no real comment on it, but I just hope that Tony Snell finds a way back to an NBA roster. That's it. That's all I got to say.
Yeah, a lot of names that you just read off there that it shows you how great of a talent evaluator I am, but a handful of them that I was super high, like Harry Giles. I think I was the biggest Harry Giles fan going into the draft and wanted the Bucks to nab him. That I thought if he could just get past those knee injuries, you got something you can build around.
Yes, that's the way it works out. But it also just goes to show, and this happens every year, but how many actual recognizable names are just out there at this time of year and try and get onto those veteran deals.
Jabari Parker was initially on the Bucks Summer League roster.
Barcelona, right?
Barcelona, yeah.
I did have someone mention the idea of Jabari Parker as a two-way guy and would it have made sense? I don't think so at this point in his career. He's probably making more cash over in Europe. And let's face it, he's living in Barcelona. He's probably going to have a pretty nice time over there in a really high-quality basketball league. Nonetheless, would have been nice to see him running around during Summer League. That'll do it for today. As I mentioned, I'm still trying to work through some teams to do previews. So let us know if there's a team you particularly want me to do a crossover podcast with. We'll try and organize that. But as for today, just let us know. Are you eyeing off the Toronto Raptors like I am in terms of potential trades or maybe blow it up potential north of the border? Let us know what you think the Toronto Raptors might do this season with their very interesting roster makeup. Justin, you take it easy. I'll be hassling you again very, very soon. But make sure you subscribe, drop a like, a comment. Let us know what you want to talk about on the show. And we'll catch you all tomorrow.